So the case study that we got in Scotland for the mixed project is how we can link up livestock farms with arable farms more effectively. And the process that we've been looking at is the availability of grazing land or grazing winter cereal land for sheep. One of the drivers behind this is the extreme weather events that we've had in recent years. So we've had some very dry periods. For example, 2018 was a very dry summer in Scotland, and that created a lack of forage for a lot of livestock farms. And they couldn't necessarily buy it in because everybody else was in the same position, and they certainly didn't want to spend huge amounts of money importing feed for their livestock. So that was one of the key things, very dry weather, but we've also had some very wet and cold weather as well, which has also had an impact. And particularly if you, with sheep, for example, trying to reduce the burden, the parasitic burden, where wet ground can host flukes and things like that. So actually having an arable farm where you don't typically have livestock on there, you've got clean ground, potentially clean grazing of the winter cereals, and this can be beneficial for the livestock in terms of the health of the animals. But conversely, you're also getting some manure return to the arable farm from the livestock, which is a benefit, always seen as a perceived benefit from the arable farms, who are quite often trying to kind of boost the organic matter of their ground. So some of them were using cover crops, but this is another approach that they can use to try and do that. So looking at kind of a mutual benefits there between the livestock and the arable farms. What we found from this work was that there are a number of take-home messages, irrespective of how long you're grazing the cereal for. So a few days, very intensive, or over a longer period of time. In almost all circumstances, the cereal grows back very effectively, so it's very resilient to sheep grazing, and it recovers very well. We also found on our small intensive trials, as well as in the farms, the participatory farms that we were part of the network, there was very little impact in terms of yield of the cereal, in terms of grain or straw. So there's very little difference in terms of the crop quality. So, for example, the grain size, distribution, and also in terms of things like the soil quality factors as well.
So the grazing worked very well, irrespective of the time period that the grazing took place. So either a maximum of 3 days in the small-scale plot trials that we had up at Craveston, or over a longer period of time, between 3 and 6 weeks, which was fairly typical for the farms, the participatory farms who had split fields. And basically the reason they had it for a longer period of time is it just meant there was a lot less time and effort taken in terms of movement of electric fencing.
Some farmers were quite happy to plant very early if they knew they were going to graze, so they would make sure that the crops, their winter cereal crops, were sown earlier than you would typically expect, because they knew that they were going to graze, so they wanted some of that early growth to then be grazed back. And others were using it as a technique if the crops just happened to be a bit early because of the weather, or very forward crops, they wanted to maybe knock them back a little bit. All of them were quite keen in the potential to reduce diseased tissue early on so that they could get away with fewer fungicide sprays. Also interested in things like improving tillering, which we didn't really find very much evidence of that. And they're also interested in terms of things like the impact on the soil. We didn't see any change in terms of organic matter because we were looking over such a short period of time. But there was certainly an indication that there were more worms in the area that had been grazed than in the area that hadn't been grazed. There was also the opportunity for them to get some income for the grazing. So if somebody had their sheep on the ground, then there was an agreement made in terms of how many pence per sheep per day was being used for the grazing. There are a number of advantages of having this additional forage availability from the winter cereals. For a start, the actual value of the cereals, the winter cereals as forage crop, in terms of the quality of that material, the feed value of that material is really quite high when looked at through analysis protocols. So things like crude protein can be really quite good, sort of 30%, something like that, or certainly mid-20s. The D values are very good as well. They're sort of in the high 80s to low 90s. So again, these are good values. And also the hay ME, the metabolizable energy, is also very good. Typically in the sort of 13.5 to sort of 14.5 level. So these are all kind of values which you would associate with a high quality silage. So pretty good. And this is actually the case for all the crops that we've looked at. So we've looked at winter wheat, we've looked at winter barley, and we've looked at winter oats, and all of them have a pretty solid value in terms of the feed value there.
We had a group of French farmers who came across to see our trials, both the small scale ones and also some of the participatory farmer trials, and they were so impressed that they had actually been in contact with their neighbours to get sheep grazing some of their winter crops by the time they'd actually got home, and they're still doing that at the moment.